Before diving into this incredible story, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the bell. Every story here has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. The sound of engines filled the cabin as passengers settled in, some chatting, others immersed in their screens. She moved calmly, pulling her small suitcase behind her, dressed simply but elegantly. Her smile remained polite, despite the day's fatigue. As soon as she passed the front row, a cold stare struck her. The flight attendant, visibly annoyed, called out to her, "You can't stay here, miss. Your seat is further back." She obeyed, trying not to show her embarrassment. But the worst came when an arrogant passenger sitting near the aisle leaned towards her with a sneer, "You don't look like you belong here." His stifled laughter along with other passengers made her feel small. Every word, every gesture, was meant to humiliate. She felt her heart clench, but remained silent, maintaining her dignity despite the offense. What they all didn't know was that this plane wasn't just a means of transportation for her. It was her husband's domain. He, a few rows away, watched the scene with icy calm. Every taunt, every gesture of condescension registered in his mind. Her cheeks flushed, but it wasn't from shame, it was from suppressed anger. Then came the moment when the arrogant passenger crossed the line. A mocking remark about her plain attire caused her husband to stand up, imposing silence with his mere presence. The passenger's murmurings died away. With quiet but implacable authority, he announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, let me make one thing clear, this woman is my wife, and we are the owners of this company." A shock ran through the cabin. The laughter died down, the stares lowered. Those who had thought they could belittle her understood their mistake. And she, for the first time since the beginning of the flight, felt her spirits lighten. Humiliation had turned into triumph. She pushed her suitcase down the narrow aisle of the plane, trying to remain invisible. Every passenger she passed seemed to be judging her, a mocking smile here, a skeptical look there. She had planned a quiet trip, but from the moment she boarded, the signals were clear, she was not welcome. The stewardess, a cold smile on her lips, directed her to a seat near the middle of the cabin. "It will be better here, madam." She obeyed, gritting her teeth, aware that simply remaining polite would not prevent her from being subjected to the murmurs and whispers of the passengers. A few rows back, a man in a suit eyed her with disdain. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" he asked haughtily, laughing with his companions. The other passengers burst out laughing, some giving knowing glances. She felt her heart sink, but remained motionless, showing nothing. Then her husband entered the scene, silent but imposing. He stood up from his row, his eyes fixed on the arrogant man and the stewardess. The murmur of the cabin gradually died away as his gaze pierced the crowd like an invisible blade. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice calm but firm. "Let me clarify something, this woman is my wife. And we own this airline." A heavy silence followed. The laughter died down, faces reddened. Those who had thought they could humiliate him were stunned. The hostess, suddenly aware of her mistake, looked away. The arrogant man, frozen, understood that his supposed superiority had collapsed in an instant. She looked at him, a small smile on her lips, finally feeling free of shame. What had begun as a public humiliation was turning into a silent triumph, under the proud and protective gaze of her husband. After her husband's announcement, the cabin fell into a heavy silence. The passengers who had mocked her were at a loss for words. Some looked away, others murmured among themselves, unable to believe what they had just heard. The arrogant man in the hallway, flushed with shame, tried to muster up his courage. I didn't know." He stammered, but his voice was lost in the general murmur. His hesitant tone contrasted with the calm assurance of his husband, who returned to his seat, leaving behind him an icy atmosphere. The hostess, meanwhile, approached timidly to apologize. "Madam, I'm really sorry for..." She trailed off, unable to find the right words. The truth crushed her, the hierarchy had just been publicly and irrevocably reminded her. Some passengers clumsily tried to re-establish a normal conversation, but the tension remained palpable. She discreetly observed each reaction, inwardly savoring this moment, after minutes of awkwardness and tension, the balance of power had finally shifted in her favor. Then her husband leaned toward her, his voice quiet but protective. "Ignore them. They've just learned a lesson they won't soon forget." She nodded, her heart light. What had started as a simple humiliation had turned into a silent, resounding victory. As the plane continued its flight, a new respect began to emerge in the air, not based on wealth or visible power, but on dignity, calm, and self-control. She had won, and everyone in the cabin had just discovered it. The atmosphere in the cabin had changed. The looks that, a few minutes earlier, had been full of contempt and mockery, were now filled with curiosity, even respect. Some passengers whispered among themselves, visibly impressed by the calm and authority of the man and the dignity of his wife. The arrogant man in the corridor, still flushed with shame, looked away and withdrew. He no longer dared to speak, aware that he had been publicly humiliated by his own ignorance. The hostess, meanwhile, came and sat down nearby to apologize again, this time sincerely. "Madam, I beg your pardon for my behavior. This should never have happened." She smiled softly, accepting the gesture with grace. It wasn't about revenge, but to show that dignity is never lost, even in the face of humiliation. Her husband, still at her side, placed a protective hand on her shoulder, a subtle reminder that the situation was under control. As the flight progressed, several passengers approached her timidly, curious to know more about this woman who had managed to remain calm in the face of adversity. She responded politely, but exuded a quiet strength that commanded respect. Even the children watched with fascination as this woman transformed humiliation into silent power. The lesson was clear: true power lies not in arrogance, but in self-control, patience, and dignity. When the plane landed, the passengers' appreciative murmurs still echoed through the cabin. What had begun as a moment of humiliation had ended in a resounding display of moral strength. She stepped off the plane with a light heart, and the looks of those who had judged her had changed forever. The plane had just landed, and passengers were beginning to get up to collect their luggage. The atmosphere was still tense. Those who had tried to humiliate him a few minutes earlier now walked with their heads bowed, aware that their arrogance had been exposed. As she left the cabin, the stewardess accompanied her with a mixture of respect and apology. "Madam, I assure you that this will not happen again. You have my highest consideration." She nodded, a discreet smile on her lips. This gesture of recognition was worth far more than a belated apology. It was proof that her dignity had triumphed. The arrogant man who had dared to mock her stood aside, whispering to his companions, "I never imagined." But no words could undo the humiliation he had just suffered. He had learned a lesson no one in that cabin would forget: never judge someone by their appearance. Outside, the scene took an unexpected turn. Passengers who had witnessed the incident approached to greet her, some with admiration, others with respect mixed with curiosity. She walked confidently, her husband at her side, and everyone understood that they were not just a passenger, but a woman and a man whose strength and integrity commanded respect. Even the photographers and journalists at the airport, alerted by the commotion on the plane, captured this moment. The initial humiliation had been reversed, transformed into a dazzling display of dignity and quiet power. And as they left the airport, hand in hand, she felt free of any resentment. Experience had proven once and for all that true greatness is measured neither by apparent wealth nor ostentatious power, but by the ability to remain dignified and self-possessed in the most humble moments. Back home, she still felt light, as if the weight of humiliation had been lifted for good. Her husband, proud and calm, smiled at her with protective tenderness. "You were incredible today," he murmured. She responded with a simple smile, knowing that true victory lay not in the admiring glances of others, but in her own self-control. In the days that followed, the incident spread throughout the company and beyond. Some passengers who had witnessed the incident shared the story with their friends and colleagues. The once humiliated woman unwittingly became a symbol of dignity and quiet strength. The arrogant man, however, had to face the reality of his own vanity. His colleagues looked at him differently, aware that he had been publicly corrected without violence, simply by the truth and the imposing presence of his wife and husband. Every mocking smile he had given was replaced by palpable embarrassment. And for her, the lesson was clear: dignity and self-control always trump arrogance and spite. She had faced humiliation, but she had emerged stronger, respected, and admired. Her husband had been her shield, but it was her inner strength that had truly changed the situation. At the end of the week, when she looked back on that flight, she smiled inwardly. What had begun as a moment of shame had turned into a resounding triumph. And every time she remembered the embarrassed looks of those who had tried to put her down, she knew she had gained more than just their respect, she had gained her own peace and true power. A few days after the robbery, news of the reverse humiliation circulated quietly in the company's social and professional circles. Colleagues, partners, and even clients came specifically to greet the woman they had thought fragile, and to discover the dignity and strength she exuded. In her husband's office, the atmosphere had changed. Employees who had once judged or underestimated this woman now paid attention to her words and actions. Her calm and self-control had commanded a spontaneous respect, more powerful than any official authority. The arrogant man of theft, for his part, could no longer be so haughty. His professional relationships were now tinged with a certain caution. Everyone knew that he had been publicly corrected, and that there was no room for gratuitous arrogance. For her, this episode had reinforced a fundamental truth: true power was never in money, rank, or appearances, but in how one stood tall in the face of adversity. The smiles and gestures of respect that now came her way were pleasant, but secondary. Her victory, intimate and personal, had already been won. And in that newfound calm, she understood that every slight, every contemptuous look she had received, had been an opportunity in disguise, a chance to reveal her strength, to command respect, and to show everyone that dignity is not negotiable. She hadn't just triumphed on the plane, she had transformed her own life and subtly influenced those of others around her. A few weeks later, the scene of the flight resurfaced in conversations and in some specialized media. A video shared by a passenger had discreetly circulated on social networks, showing the tension in the cabin and her husband's reaction. Quickly, the once humiliated woman became a symbol of dignity and quiet strength. At a charity event organized by the airline, she was invited to speak. The admiring glances from the audience, the recognition in the eyes of her colleagues and passengers present, all reinforced her position, that of a woman who had transformed humiliation into silent power. The journalists approached, curious to hear her thoughts. She spoke calmly and elegantly, explaining that true greatness had nothing to do with appearance or social status, but with maintaining self-control in the face of adversity. Her words resonated powerfully, inspiring all who listened. Even the arrogant man from the flight in the room could only look at her with a mixture of respect and regret. He understood that the lesson he had received on the plane went beyond humiliation. It showed that no amount of arrogance could overcome dignity and self-control. At the end of the event, her husband took her hand and whispered, "You have changed more than just their opinions, you have inspired everyone here." She smiled, knowing that this moment marked not only the end of humiliation, but the beginning of a new recognition, based on inner strength and dignity. Months later, the plane incident had become a quiet but powerful landmark in the city's professional and social circles. Passengers who had witnessed the initial humiliation and its aftermath still recounted the story, no longer as a mere incident, but as an example of quiet strength and respect imposed without violence. For her, life had returned to normal, but with a new twist. She knew she could transform any adversity into strength. Her husband, always at her side, watched with pride as her presence and self-control inspired those around her. Together, they formed a duo respected and admired, not just for their material power, but for the integrity and dignity they conveyed. The arrogant man on the flight had learned not to be quick to judge, and even some passengers had changed their behavior, realizing that true respect is not earned by wealth or arrogance, but by character and self-control. And as she thought back on the flight that had begun in humiliation and mockery, she smiled inwardly. Every contemptuous glance had been an opportunity in disguise, every arrogant gesture, an opportunity to demonstrate her strength. What had begun as a humiliating moment had ended in a resounding and lasting triumph. Dignity, patience, and inner strength had won the day. She now knew one thing for sure: no matter the adversity, true greatness always lies in self-mastery, and no one, ever, could take that victory away from her.